I thought I would start by being a bit more topical than you might expect, this being an election year. The question may arise in some of your minds as to why politicians can get away with lying to people. We all kind of assume that politicians lie to people, but how do they get away with it? And there was a very interesting study conducted at the Harvard Business School that cast some light on this subject. What these researchers did was, after pre-recording a speaker answering a question about universal health care, they attached the same answer to 3 separate questions. The original one about health care, another one about illegal drug use, and a final one about the war on terror. Then they showed so they basically have this 3 different questions with one answer. Then they showed the 3 tapes to separate groups of subjects and asked them to assess the truthfulness of the speaker. Well, it turned out that when the speaker gave a response about health care to a question about illegal drug use, which is a related but not identical subject, his audience found him just as trustworthy as did the group who heard him answer a question about universal health care. So, in fact, when quizzed afterward, almost none of the subjects in the drug use scenario could remember exactly what question had been asked. So essentially, the researchers decided that the reason that politicians can dodge so effectively is that people have such short attention spans. There's a lot that's going on that we take in, and there's very little that we actually can process. And this is a good way of introducing G.I. Gurdjieff, who some of you have heard of, and who's the subject of tonight's talk. It's Gurdjieff, although sometimes you hear it Gurdjieff. One of the main themes of whose work was waking up from the sleep of everyday life. Now, I'll say a little bit about Gurdjieff's biography. He was a fascinating character, and in many ways a very mysterious one. The year of his birth, for example, one of his passports said 1872. Another said 1877. So we'll just write down 1866. That's probably the most plausible date given by his most reliable biographer. And he died in 1949. So he was definitely a part of the early 20th century, but he's been one of the most influential spiritual teachers of the past century. And he ranks up there with H.P. Blavatsky and C.G. Jung in terms of the impact that he's had on spiritual thought. And I'll go into some of the reasons for that during this talk. Gurdjieff had an interesting life. He was born on the border between then Russia and the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian side of the border. His father was Greek, despite the name. He changed it a little bit, and his mother was Armenian. And he grew up in this world of very mysterious and almost biblical conditions, where people still lived in pastoral conditions, and there was still a great deal of folklore and lost wisdom that was circulating around. His father was a bard of a traditional kind, and his father sang one song that Gurdjieff said he came across years later. And this song was about Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh was the hero of a Sumerian myth. And although Gurdjieff had not read about Gilgamesh until years later, he found that the song that was written down was exactly the one that his father had sung. So this had been passed down orally for probably some 4,000 years. And it was in this milieu that he grew up, and he became interested in finding out what exactly the secret of the universe was, and probing deeply into the mysteries of why things are the way they are. He went out on a search fairly early in life throughout Central Asia, throughout the Caucasus, parts of his native country, Egypt, to find out some of these truths. And where exactly he got his teachings always remains a little bit unclear. As I said, he was rather mysterious. He hinted that he had become, well, he more than hinted, he said he had become in touch with a very ancient mystical brotherhood called the Sarmung Brotherhood, somewhere in what would be today Afghanistan, and that these people had transmitted a sacred teaching that went back to the days of Babylon, like the teaching of, like the Song of Gilgamesh itself. So Gurdjieff, some people don't really believe this. Some people say that what he really taught was a form of Sufism. Are people familiar with Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam? Some said it was a version of esoteric Christianity, and Gurdjieff once or twice hinted that this might be the case. Others have all kinds of answers, but Gurdjieff said that his own teaching was, at any rate, independent of any other known lines. And what he came up with is certainly very unique and very powerful and very complicated. And I'm certainly not going to be able to go into great detail about all of it in this lecture, or perhaps even over many lectures. So after his search, where he went, as I say, throughout Central Asia, Egypt, and the Caucasus, and possibly parts beyond, possibly Tibet, he ended up in Russia, which was, after all, the country that he had been born in. Sometime around, we first surfaces around 1914, just around the outbreak of the First World War. And he started collecting a group of students to explore some of these teachings with him. And these groups, which were in Moscow and St. Petersburg at the time, formed the nucleus of the people who would later perpetuate his work. One of them, and here's another exotic sounding name, was P.D. Uspensky. Uspensky was very different from Gurdjieff. He was a journalist who was interested in mathematics and philosophy. He had a fairly conventional upper-class Russian upbringing of the day. And he came into contact with Gurdjieff around 1915. And Uspensky is important because one of his works, entitled In Search of the Miraculous, is perhaps the most accessible and, I don't know, you could say the best introduction to Gurdjieff's work. Can everybody see, by the way? So in 1914, he started assembling these groups in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and he began to impart to them this very interesting system, which had one of its bases the idea that we are, in our ordinary circumstances in life, asleep. And he went on to say that this is not a natural sleep, but a kind of hypnotic stupor, kind of low-grade hypnotic reverie that we go through. And there are many implications to this idea, but I think you can all see that there's some truth to it, even apart from anything I might say. Uspensky, for example, said that once he'd been exposed to this idea, he was walking down the street and he saw a man walking past him who was obviously completely asleep. He had all these ideas, dreams, fantasies, whatever, going through his head, and he didn't see anything of the world around him. And what this means is that since all of us can probably say we've been in that situation and are in that situation frequently, that to some degree or another we are asleep. And getting out of this sleep was one of Gurdjieff's chief objectives. And I'll go into more detail about that in a little bit, but I'll go say a little bit more about his biography. As you'll know if you know history, this was just during the First World War, and it was also the time, just about the time of the Russian Revolution, which took place in 1917. And at this point, Gurdjieff and his followers had formed enough of a nucleus so that they began to move together. And there were huge disruptions in population. A lot of people left Russia, especially the upper classes, the ones that weren't shot. And he and his pupils made their way first down to his native area in the Caucasus, and eventually through to Constantinople, or today's Istanbul. And finally, after some wandering around, they ended up in France around 1922, where he started a school. He bought an old abbey about 40 miles outside of Paris and opened up an esoteric school called the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. And what the harmonious development of man means is something else I'll get to. He came to America in 1924, and by this time he'd gotten his pupils together to do a series of exhibitions of what he called the movements, which are these very elaborate and very, very difficult sacred dances. And basically, and I've done them myself, although badly, what you're basically doing is executing one kind of pattern of movements with your arms, another with your head, another with your feet, while going through all these dance steps. And this is not easy. There was a film made about Gurdjieff's life called Meetings with Remarkable Men, which was based on his autobiography of the same title. And I don't know, have any of you ever seen this? Yeah. If you do see it, toward the end of the film are some demonstrations of the actual movements done by people in the Gurdjieff work today, or who were in the Gurdjieff work in 1979 when the film was made. What was he trying to accomplish with this? Well, it had to do with this harmonious development of man. And one thing that was important in his idea was the development of a finer grade of attention than we normally possess or demonstrate. And this work with attention is probably, well, certainly one of the central themes of Gurdjieff's teaching. And we've already seen exactly how bad our attention is. You know, you can watch a presidential debate and they'll ask the candidate one question, he'll answer a completely different question, and no one will remember it. So this has practical implications, as well as, I suppose, political implications. But one of his teachings was that we consist of a number of different centers, or even brains, as he put them. And this is not really all that different from modern neurology, which speaks of three brains in our, we have like a frontal cortex, an emotional kind of limbic system, and the medulla oblongata, roughly speaking, which has to do with movement and respiration and that kind of thing. And Gurdjieff talked about these three centers, and he sometimes did call them three brains. Now, this is a somewhat of a simplification of his thought, but it's as far as I'm going to want to go in a talk like this. And one of the teachings that he had was that these three centers are rather badly connected to one another. And he spoke about, in a metaphor of, imagine this carriage, where the carriage is all beat up and neglected. The horse is a good animal, but has basically been starved and abused. And the driver is drunk. And the master who's going to even direct where this carriage is supposed to go isn't even there. And he said this was very much a picture of our condition. The carriage corresponds to the body and the functions of the body. The horse corresponds to the emotions, which is a almost universal symbol of sacred science and esoteric thought. The horse is the emotions, and the driver is the mind. And the master, well, what is this master who isn't there? Which is a very good question, and one that Gurdjieff offered an answer to. In any case, to go on with his life a little bit, he stayed at this place, and he stayed in France basically until his death. And his school disbanded. His abbey was foreclosed on. He didn't always have the greatest luck in getting or keeping students. Sometimes he drove them away. Sometimes he felt that a student had gotten as much as they could get out of him, and rather than encouraging dependency and this kind of lifelong relationship, he would do something that would break with them and send them off on their own. His methods were often somewhat sharp and eccentric, to say the least. He liked to spend money, and he would have these elaborate dinners, which constituted a good part of his group meetings in Paris of the 30s and 40s. He would have these elaborate dinners in this tiny, crowded, hot apartment in Paris. And in addition to having all sorts of exotic food, a lot of which he cooked himself, he would insist that people took part in what he called toasts to idiots. And what you would have to do, he had a list of idiots, of different types of idiot. You know, the round idiot, the square idiot, the enlightened idiot, and so on. And the task was, after you'd had a couple of shots of vodka, to stand up when the toast to your particular kind of idiocy was called. And this gives you a flavor of Gurdjieff's methods, which were eccentric, but also had some wisdom in them. One of the things that you may find interesting about many types of esoteric science or thought is this idea of types. You know, what type of person are you? The most obvious system of typing is that of astrology, where principally your sun sign is considered to be sort of like a key to your, not so much personality, but to your essential nature. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, and if I asked each and every one of you what your sun sign was, I'm sure everybody here would be able to tell me without any great trouble. But Gurdjieff's system, which he never really imparted to anyone else, so that no one really toasts idiots anymore among his disciples or the heirs to his disciples, was this kind of way of seeing into one's own type. And he said this was very, very hard to explain in ordinary words, but you had to see yourself in a certain way. And what that way was is extremely important in his teaching. Let's go back to the idea that we are all asleep. One of the features of this sleep, he said, is the fact that we don't remember ourselves. What does that mean? Well, it goes back to the man who's dreaming on his walking down the street in St. Petersburg. He's kind of going through, he's submerged in all of these thoughts and ideas, and he's can walk into something without any trouble if he's not too careful. And it goes back to Gurdjieff's idea of this partly. I mean, there are many ways I could address this subject, but I'll do it from this way because I think it makes the most sense. These three centers, which can be simplified into this tripartite system, right? You know, the driver, the carriage, the horse, the carriage itself. And the fact that the master is absent, right? I'm not really there. I'm just like wandering around in this low-grade hypnotic stupor, so the master isn't even around. And one thing that he emphasized was that a great deal of what goes on in our mind and emotions and body is what he called mechanical. That this stuff just goes on and on. You just kind of get up and follow your routine without thinking much about it. You go through, a habitual litany of worries, anxieties, thoughts, dreams, and so on. And it goes on without you. You can't really stop it. And these things have very little to do with one another. You're driving in your car and you're upset with your boss. Your body's doing one thing. Hopefully it's, more or less navigating the road. Your mind is thinking about that thing that boss of yours said to you, 2 weeks ago, and your emotions are getting all upset about it. So there are these all kinds of things going on, and this is part of what Gurdjieff called the sleep of man. And it's not hard to see this as our situation. This is the state of consciousness we live in most of the time. And it was to combat this state of consciousness that Gurdjieff brought his teaching. What sort of work did he suggest? Well, let's perform a little experiment. All of you have feet. Can you be aware of the sensation of your feet on the floor or wherever they happen to be while listening to me talking? That is to say, can you divide your attention? Can you save some of your attention for your feet on the floor and some of your attention for me? Most people will find this fairly hard to do. And you kind of lapse into it. You may remember the exercise for like a few seconds and you forget it. And even if you're really good at it, you're probably going back to it rather than staying connected with this exercise in any kind of continuous way. So how are you asleep? Well, you're not even aware of your own body on a moment-to-moment basis. And, or we are not aware of our own bodies on a moment-to-moment basis. We're thinking one thing, the body is doing another. Even with me here, my mind is doing one thing. I'm speaking here, and I'm kind of wandering around on this. And are these centers in real alignment here? Well, maybe, maybe not. And this is our condition. So one of the things Gurdjieff brought was a practice that he called self-remembering. And this had many, many different aspects to it, and many different forms. You could say it's being aware of being aware. Sometimes it's phrased as. Sleep of man. The sleep of man. And there were many, many exercises that he gave to try to break this mechanicalness and this slumber. And he referred to them as alarm clocks. He said, well, the problem with waking up is that, you need someone to set the alarm clocks. That is to say, someone who has some idea, someone who's awake enough to do that. And B, you get used to the alarm clocks. And as he said, eventually you sleep all the more soundly for them. And that's why he had these various types of exercises, some of which were quite challenging and some of which were fairly simple. But all of which were designed for self-remembering. What does this mean? Well, it means a greater integration of these things. Mind and the body are a little closer together. The thinking center, has some awareness, some kind of contact with your feet on the floor, for example. Later on, the emotions are the hardest to deal with because they're so overpowering, so they're sort of brought in last. But eventually, you start to work with the emotions as well. And you become aware of the motions that are going on inside you. Again, being aware of these emotions. Now, what's interesting about this is, in a curious sort of way, this being aware seems to create a little distance, right? Suddenly you're aware of being aware of what's going on inside you. And it seems to create a little distance from all of these things. Well, that's a good thing in Gurdjieff's view. Because part of our problem is what he called identification. You identify with the emotions that are going through. You identify with your thoughts. You think you are those things. You know, you have no, I say you, but I mean we. You know, have no conscious sense of ourselves as all these things are going on. And the attention kind of shifts in a somewhat random way. If we become aware of a pain or something like that, suddenly, yeah, you're aware of your body. But the pain goes away, and then, you know, you're on to some emotion about something somebody said to you 2 weeks ago. Or to something you read in the newspaper this morning that sends your train of thoughts off in another direction. It's very interesting. One thing I've been kind of noticing is just the train of associations that go through my head. You know, while I'm taking a shower, I realize I'm thinking about something, and I was thinking about quite a different thing 2 or 3 minutes before. And it's interesting to trace the kind of string of associations that led you from one thing to another. Oh, this reminded me of that person I knew in college, and this reminds me of that time with me and that person in college when we did this and that, you know, that kind of thing. And it's a fascinating exercise to see how these associations work. And I would say it helps a little bit in the work of self-remembering. Because suddenly you aren't these things. You aren't caught up with these things. You aren't identified with them. You're free from them for a little bit of a while. Gurdjieff prescribed a lot of different exercises of this kind, and some of them were quite simple. One of them would say, be like the one I suggested to you about being aware of your feet on the floor. How's that going, by the way? Another might be, and I remember one exercise I was given, which I found quite powerful and I try to remember fairly often, is when you look out the window, you don't go out the window. You know how you're looking out a window, suddenly you're just out there? You know, whatever you're looking at, you suddenly become transfixed by it. It takes a real effort to have some sense of myself sitting here while still seeing out the window. And little by little, theory went, you start to draw in some kind of greater connection between the mind, the emotions, and the body. And this is the master. Remember, the master was missing from the carriage. The master begins to show up. Who's the master? The master is real I, Gurdjieff called it. Going back to all of this, he said, all of this mechanicality, all of this kind of being all over the place all the time, means that we are really not unified. One minute you say I to one thing, one minute you say I to something else, and these totally different subpersonalities arise. Gurdjieff is saying that to one extent or another, all of us are victims of multiple personality disorder. The people who are diagnosed and have some real problems with it. But the you that you are with your boss is not going to be the I that I am with my children. You have one eye, a couple of eyes for work, one for subordinates, one for people who are superior, one for family, one for friends, one for children, one for parents, and even some very small ones that kind of crop up at seemingly odd times. And all of these little things are making you say I to them. I remember Jerry Seinfeld had this routine about day guy and night guy. And night guy, night guy is the one who says, tomorrow I'm going to get up and go to the gym at 6 a.m. And night guy is like fully set and sets his alarm, and he's going to go to the gym at 6 a.m. Well, the thing goes off in the morning, and day guy, completely different guy, has no intention of doing this. And this is why we make promises that we're not able to keep sometimes. One eye makes this promise. One eye quits smoking and another eye has no intention of quitting smoking and has not even really heard about the idea. So what is going to pull this all together? Well, this real I, that is to say what you truly are. And what this has to do with is this, it's cultivated by this finer sense of attention. That little by little starts to draw all these things together and pulls them into something like a true I. Notice, to go back to something I mentioned earlier, remember the movements that I was talking about? Well, what are you doing? You're using quite different parts of your body. You have to keep different patterns. I mean, it's like, can I do it while talking to you? Evidently not too well. It's like that on a major scale. And in order to cultivate this, to do these movements, you have to have this kind of higher attention. Sometimes they'll throw in something like, start counting in French, to 10, while you're doing all of these things, just to liven things up a bit. The idea is that something begins to grow, which is more authentically yourself, that can step behind all of this stuff, so that none of them is the boss in quite the way that it was. Remember, there's a parable in the Gospels about a servant who, when the master is away, starts beating up on the other servants. Do you remember that? Well, since Gurdjieff's teaching is sometimes called a form of esoteric Christianity, there's a possible message in that. Right? The master's away, we've already established. And as soon as one eye gets center stage, he starts beating up all the others. That is to say, the eye who likes to get drunk, stifles all the others who really realize that getting drunk this often isn't so good. Or, if you have certain self-image problems, the eye that wants to starve you into having like a very, very skinny, slender, fashionable body is beating up on all the servants of the actual body, and things like anorexia and eating disorders arise. Those are literal ways in which one servant is beating up the other servants. And Gurdjieff is saying, if the master can come home, if the master can show up through this increased awareness and attention, that's less likely to happen. And that's a very, very long work, and there are many different aspects of it. I've given you two in discussing Gurdjieff's ideas here. One was these movements, which are fairly difficult to find. I mean, they're difficult to get someone to teach them to you, because there are very few people who are good at it. There are very, very few good teachers. But there are still some people who do them. And the other is through these practices that I've been describing to you, a lot of which have to do with self-remembering and self-observation he also spoke of. That is to say, once you're aware of, you have some kind of awareness of your own presence here in this room in some kind of direct, authentic way, which kind of I do you see coming to the surface? Do you see yourself wanting to be flattered? You want to, we all have some part of ourselves that wants to think of him or herself as like, better than everybody else. Then there's another side that kind of, the flip side of it, the person who always thinks, I'm worse than everybody else. Everybody else is doing this right and I'm doing it wrong. Or nobody else knows what they're talking about, I know it all. If you can start to remember yourself in this way, then you're able to observe yourself and you start to see these eyes coming up. And remember I said that you begin to break the identification with them. They still come up, but suddenly you're not them, you're not as fooled by them as you might have been at the beginning. You don't take them as seriously. And this is kind of a major step toward awakening. And eventually, this master, this kind of real I, is able to kind of bring all of these mind, emotions, and body and other centers into some kind of harmony and some kind of unison. And then, that becomes real I. Remember, the name of his institute was the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. So there's some way in which all of this stuff is inharmonious and going out all over the place, and there's some way in which these things can be kind of brought together. And Gurdjieff's ideas have had, they've circulated in the world. There are a lot of people who haven't heard the name Gurdjieff, but little by little, I think people are starting to realize that at least some of these ideas are true. Going back to the study that I quoted at the beginning, you're starting to realize how short people's attention spans are. Now, notice there's a world of difference between someone conducting a study about how people's attention spans are short, which is, kind of an interesting fact and a funny story that you can all kind of laugh about. But to see your own lack of attention is something quite different. To see myself as I get caught up in all of these worries, these anxieties, these ideas, these dreams, these fantasies, that's quite a big step, and not to become submerged in them. So that is kind of the essence of one aspect of Gurdjieff's teaching. There are a lot of others, but this is kind of the key point, and it's probably enough for the course of one lecture. He had a very elaborate view. His views were quite different from the theosophical views in some respects. He believed that, how many people are fairly familiar with theosophical ideas? So maybe about half. He believed, for example, that the astral body was not something that you have. In theosophy, the astral body is kind of the body of basically feelings and thoughts that kind of circulate, particularly feelings that circulate around your physical body. But Gurdjieff said that there really wasn't any such thing as an astral body, or that you had to develop it by cultivating this real I. And that immortality was really only possible for people who had developed their astral bodies in this way. He had a very elaborate terminology that I won't give to you. So for Gurdjieff, the cultivation of this real I is very important because he says man has kind of the possibility of immortality, but not necessarily genuine immortality. All of this stuff, all of this mind, emotions, body, all these things circulating, what sort of immortality do they have? And whether you agree with Gurdjieff or whether you agree with the Theosophical view, there's a lot of us, a large part of ourselves that is obviously not going to be immortal. Let's say you survive death. Let's say there's a consciousness that survives death. Well, is this consciousness going to be a Republican or a Democrat? I mean, once it's dead, are you gonna care who wins the election in November? You know, you don't have a body anymore. Does this I that survives still like ice cream? So a lot of this, in a sense, dies and has to die. But in a sense, the real I, that is to say, something that underlies and underpins all of these things, is what truly survives. I don't necessarily think his views are that as different from theosophical views as they might seem, but there are some apparent differences, and I thought I would mention them. Gurdjieff didn't have any connection with the Theosophical Society. Uspensky, in his early days, lectured for the Theosophical Society in St. Petersburg before the revolution. Well, I think I've kind of come to the end of what I can really say. There's a lot more that I can go into, but I think at this point I'd prefer to hear questions and comments.
We will take questions, and if you have a question, please wait for the microphone. I'll bring it to you. And we will also take questions from online. If you have a question, back to you.
Work. What do you say about the phenomena of you answering the question before I asked it? In other words, my question was going to be the relationship of Gurdjieff and the Theosophical Society and ideas.
Well, it was a fairly, since this is a Theosophical Society, it's a fairly obvious question to bring up. The Theosophical Society, the Theosophical view is quite different from Gurdjieff's in that Gurdjieff viewed the astral body as kind of the key or the seed of genuine immortality. In Theosophy, the astral body, this kind of organized system of feelings that kind of surround you, is supposed to die. It doesn't really last much more than the physical body. It has its own kind of duration in the afterlife, and then it goes. And then you live in the world of Devachan, which has more to do with the mental realm. And the true I exists as kind of it's called a monad. And this is what reincarnates over and over and over again. For Gurdjieff, he didn't really think that unless you developed your I to some kind of degree, there was any kind of immortality that was really possible. So that is a major difference. The similarities are stronger than the differences. There is a view of kind of the world as a coherent living organism with many different levels of reality, which we all participate in. The idea that human evolution is possible in some way kind of necessary as part of the functioning of this universe. Gurdjieff had an odd idea about war. War, he said, was the result of the cosmos needing certain forces that people give off, that living creatures give off, and they give them off when they die. And when the universe needs these particular types of forces, tension kind of builds up and then there's a war. Well, said Gurdjieff, that's all true, and that's why there's war, because there's this organic need for this force. He had a funny name for it, the sacred Askokin. He made up lots of funny names for a lot of these things, which are a lot of times private jokes. But he said, this kind of work, this inner development, also produces that force. So we sort of have a choice. We can either choose to work on ourselves and give off this energy that the universe needs, or we can have it extracted from us willy-nilly. And it's certainly one of the more fascinating explanations of why there's war, because of course everybody hates war, everybody's always against it, and yet there are always wars all the time. It somehow seems inconsistent. You could almost say, going back to this idea, that one eye in humanity likes wars and another eye doesn't. Or one eye in an individual likes wars and another side doesn't. I mean, we all have these impulses toward violence that are usually pretty well sublimated. But it's not hard to see yourself, thinking sometimes, well, we should just, blam our fists down. What we should do is always kind of interesting. And I would say what we should do in that kind of almost political sense is almost kind of a manifestation of sleep. We ought to do this. Well, who is this we? Or, more properly, who is this I? I know what to do with the federal deficit. I have trouble balancing my own checkbook, but I know what to do with the federal deficit. I know the answer to world peace, but as it turns out, I can't even get along with my neighbors and coworkers. Right? There's an I that has this idea of what ought to be done, and then there's these emotions which know nothing about that. Yeah.
Okay, you talked about the attention, and from my understanding, the mind is incapable, the physical brain is incapable, of focusing on more than one thing at a time. You do have people who can split second instantaneously appear to be focusing on two things at a time, but from my understanding, physically, we just are incapable of doing that, which leads to my, question is that do you think that, I guess what I'm asking is the subconscious, what relationship would that have, and is that what you're trying to do, is split your brain in a way that it works with the mind so that your subconscious comes out, or how does the subconscious play with that real I? And what does the brain have to do with this? Because your brain can't focus on more than one thing at a time. It's impossible. They've scientifically proven you can't do it. You might be so fast it appears to be, but you just physically can't do it. So what would you say to all of that?
I don't know.
I don't. A couple of things. One is, even if you're not able to literally focus on two things at one time, and there is this kind of switching back and forth, at least there's a greater connection. At least there's some more integration. To use kind of neurological terms, one part of the brain is a little bit better hooked up to another. The subconscious, there's a lot going on at the subconscious level. Since Gurdjieff said we're not really conscious at all, a great deal of what goes on is subconscious. I don't think he would particularly use he had no real use for Freudian psychoanalysis or similar theories like that as that. But you know, he would say that there's a lot of this that's going on under the surface.
So would you say that he would like divide that mind into 2 or 3 pieces of, you know, the conscious, the subconscious, and then maybe another state that is observing everything?
Well, he's no.
Sorry for taking you down that
That's all right.
path, people. That's just how I am. So.
It's all right. He actually said that there were several states of consciousness. They're not really quite the way that 20th century psychology described them. But there was one kind of consciousness of the consciousness of the sleep. There's real sleep, right? Then there's what he called the sleep of daily life, which we've been talking about. And then there are levels of higher consciousness, you know, and you can read books about cosmic consciousness and that kind of thing, higher mystical states. But he said what was missing is this kind of state of self-remembering. That is to say, something that's capable of taking and integrating these higher states of consciousness. So what he would say is that, you know, a lot of this is going on is in fact subconscious. And part of the work of kind of building this real I is to make it more conscious and to transform it. He said that there are certain processes that are going on within us, in our minds, that can only take place in the dark. That is to say, there are certain kinds of feelings, thoughts, attitudes, that sort of thing, can only exist if you're not really seeing them. You know, it's like, you know, living in a bad city apartment where, you know, you turn on the light and the roaches scurry away. It's the very act of becoming conscious or trying to become conscious starts to transform a lot of these processes in an almost alchemical way. So that's an attempt at an answer.
Yes, another question from the back.
Richard, could you talk for a minute about Beelzebub's Tales, why Gurdjieff wrote it in the way he did, and what effect it may have in reading it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like a lot of things about Gurdjieff, I didn't mention this, but his great magnum opus, modestly entitled All and Everything, and this is about a 12 or 1300 page work of science fiction. And in this, Beelzebub is not the devil. I mean, you know, usually Beelzebub is the devil or a devil or some member of the infernal hierarchy. But actually, he's a respected member of the cosmic hierarchy. And he's going on a spaceship with his grandson. And his grandson says, you know, I'm kind of interested about these curious three-brained beings on this little planet called Earth. Beelzebub says, well, I've been there on planet Earth several times, and I'll tell you all about it. And he gives this elaborate story of, you know, kind of a history of the human race, and talks about things like Atlantis, Babylon. He goes up to kind of America in the Jazz Age, because this was written, you know, in the 20s, so that's kind of contemporary at that point. And the language is very difficult a lot of times. The sentences are very convoluted. He has lots of made-up words, like I already gave you one, the sacred Askokin, the stuff that we give off either when we're killed or when we're working on ourselves. The octave, you know, he had a theory of the sacred octave, which I also didn't go into, that he called the heptapara parshinoch, which is a Gurdjieff knew, a dozen languages or so, and he put, words and phrases from them together. And it's intentionally difficult. And again, it's intentionally difficult because he felt that if you didn't put the effort into reading it, you were not going to value it. You're not going to value anything you don't pay for, he said. And if you read it, in a way, it's less about conveying some sort of information, because this is a whole science fiction story, and who knows how literally he meant these stories of Atlantis and other kind of semi-lost civilizations anyway. There was one in the Gobi Desert called Tikliamish. We're a lost civilization in the Gobi Desert, but whether it was called Tikliamish or whether it had anything to do with what Gurdjieff was talking about is anyone's guess. But again, if you put this kind of effort into paying attention to it, that will kind of cultivate something in yourself. And his goal in writing it was, in a sense, not so much to convey information as to destroy our illusions about ourselves. And a lot of the thing is Beelzebub telling his grandson about these kind of poor, benighted creatures on the earth who are, kind of chasing their own tails, and they have no idea of the sacred laws that every other conscious being knows about in the universe. So it is humbling to read it, as a human being. And I think the impact of it comes more from that kind of realization than necessarily the ideas that are contained in it, although there are a lot of those as well.
Similar to admitting to be an idiot.
Yeah. And that's it. I mean, unless you can have the distance to see all of this stuff and to see how, in a sense, ridiculous you are, or how ridiculous I am, you're not going to be free from this stuff in the way that you kind of need to be. So, and he had an extremely eccentric sense of humor, but humor was like very much part of his way of teaching.
We have another question.
Yes, sir. Very interesting. I understand the I, but I've heard though that for a person to be whole, for example, health-wise or mentally, physically, and spiritually, which is what I study, the mind, emotions, and body have to be together, have to be one, and all have to be equally healed or equally together or something like that. And so I was wondering, what you meant by them being when you're in mastery or whatever, that they're separate. I didn't understand that, because I take it that all three have to kind of like sing together as one.
Yeah, that's true, and that goes back to the concept of the harmonious development of man. These are kind of in effect separate, and that's kind of our plight. What he's saying is that you need something that's able to pull all these things together. And it's not so much separating these things from that, but in a sense, removing your identification with any of these things at any one time. And some kind of free attention, and that's sometimes used in Gurdjieff work, becomes liberated and is able to kind of pull these things together.
So they all are together then?
Well, to go back to the parable or the carriage and the horse, they're together, but they're kind of, in a ramshackle way. And they need to be integrated. They're always going to be separate in the sense that you're going to always have three brains. But they can work together and be much more harmoniously placed in regard to each other than they customarily are.
A Question from the back again.
I understand Gurdjieff composed, or at least collaborated on composing music. Is there any connection between that and this? Like, did you try to use the music as a vehicle for awakening others? Was that part of it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. One of his earliest pupils was a composer named Thomas de Hartmann, who worked with Gurdjieff in composing, a type of sacred music. And interestingly enough, his theory of art was quite a rich one. And he said that subjective art, the kind of art that we experience on a day-to-day basis, that is movies, books, plays, that kind of thing, in a sense comes from these kind of lower centers. And as a result, how you respond to them is very individual and highly dependent on circumstance. If your girlfriend broke up with you when a song was playing, your associations are going to make you probably hate that song for the rest of your life. Another person fell in love on a first date when that song was playing. The other person's going to love that song. Honey, this is our song. Gurdjieff tried to do what he called objective art. And objective art, he said, one of its principles was that it would have the same effect on anyone, almost in the sense of physics. He goes back to a lost work of art, which the statue of Zeus at Olympia, which is one of the 7 wonders of the world. This has long since been destroyed, and it only exists in, little tourist copies and, copies on the backs of coins and that sort of thing. That's all we really know about it. But one thing that was said about this was that it produced the same effect on everyone that saw it, which was incredible awe. And that was, he said, sacred art. And he said the way of doing this art was known in ancient civilizations who had lost much less of this than we have. And it could be used to produce very definite effects on human beings. So he was creating this music to, in a sense, lead toward the real I, as you were, asking. That it should have something like the same effect on everyone. Now, whether it really does or not, you'd have to listen to it yourself and decide. But it is very powerful. It's very haunting music. A lot of Central Asian, Caucasian tunes. It has its own kind of haunting beauty. But that was in a nutshell, his kind of theory of art and why he tried to do the music that way.